So today's topic is going to be basically how to value cards and evaluate turn cycles is like the most important thing that I really wanted to cover. And the purpose of that is I wanted to start kind of zoomed in a little bit. And then I have kind of like, I don't want to call it a curriculum because it's not like that structured, but I do have like an avenue that I want to take on going over these subjects. And what we're going to do is we're going to take like a really zoomed in approach at the beginning to cover a couple topics to get like a fundamental understanding. And then we're going to zoom out real quick, like way out, talk like macro matchup philosophy, stuff like that. And then zoom right back into the details. So it'll kind of be like a three-part thing where we're starting a little zoomed in, a little micro, then we'll zoom out and then zoom back in. And it's for a very specific reason on why we're doing that. Also, AP Physics, Dr. Crawford. Oh, man. So I spent a ton of time making sure that there were nuggets in these lessons that very experienced players could gather something from. And in fact, one of the main topics of today's lesson was from a conversation between myself and another player that has been playing the game for like 2 years. And it kind of just spawned an idea, and I wanted to run with it and see if other people could extract value from that quote unquote conversation, right? And so let's just hop right into it. This is going to be officially the first episode of Learning Curve. So welcome everybody. And today we're going to be talking about how to value cards and evaluate turn cycles. All right. First, we have to do the most basic thing ever. I know everybody's going to fall asleep on me already, but we have to evaluate cards, right? It's way easier said than done, but basically, the value of a card is the life threatened plus life saved divided by number of cards invested, right? So if you block with a card, you save 3 life, you got 3 value, assuming it blocked for 3 in the case of the E-Strike on the screen. You extracted 3 points of value from that. However, we can get a lot deeper on the same card to really identify what value can be presented from a card. So the first mode on E-Strike, which is probably the most not understood mode of E-Strike, everybody says it's a 1-card 5. Well, that's actually incorrect. And I'll explain why. The first mode on E-Strike, which for those of you who don't know, it's on the screen. You have to sync as additional cost. You have to put a card from your hand to the bottom of your deck to pay for E-Strike. So no matter what mode you pick, it's a 2-card investment. However, most people would say, oh, you're drawing a card, so therefore you're only paying 1 card to do 5 damage. The problem with that statement is if you really zoom in on it, in some decks, that answer is yes, right? In a deck like Zen, where 95% of the cards that you rip off at the top of the deck, you can extract 3 to 4 value from. Yes, that would be a true statement that this is a 1-card 5. But let's plug that card into a Guardian deck, right? And if you ever do E-Strike draw a card, either you have a fancy way to give it go again, or typically what is the case, you're ending your turn with that action. So whatever you draw off the card, you're basically forced to put it in Arsenal, right? And if that's a blue disable or something like that, or a blue buckling blow in Guardian, are you really getting a full card's value by putting that card in Arsenal? And the answer is probably no. So it was not a 1-card 5. It was a 2-card 5 plus whatever the value is off the cards you rip. So that's kind of like where a lot of the misunderstanding kind of happens. And the second mode is the most simple, right? You got a 2-card 7. Easy, or 3.5 per card. And then the third mode, which is easily the worst mode, and this is actually the biggest thing that I see new players in the game make this mistake. I will watch them eat 6 damage and then play E-Strike for 5 go again, not understanding that if they would have just blocked with 2-3 blocks, the E-Strike plus another 3 block, they would have gotten 6 value instead of the 5 that they gained from it. So now there are certain macro situations where that is the correct play, but I've seen it happen where it is definitely not. So we're going to continue. This is the general attack action balance theory. Basically, this is a theory on like how the devs balance attack actions, and there's actually a theory for defense reactions, for attack reactions, and so forth. I'm just going to cover one and then share a little bit about the D reacts and the attack reactions to kind of help people understand. But all you do is you take the pitch value as a plus value, right? So if it's red, it's 1. If it's yellow, it's 2. If it's blue, it's 3. And you add that value, right? Because it's a positive thing that you can pitch the card. Well, why is red not the floor? Well, you have cards like Gorg Tome that are sitting at an actual value of 0 that cannot be pitched. So it's red 1, yellow 2, and blue is 3. And you simply add up the pitch value, the attack, and the block, and the effect. And historically, I've given you 3 examples to basically point at exactly how most attack action cards will land on a value of 8 in some form or another. Something kind of like out of the ordinary with Ravenous Rabble it costs 0, so you don't subtract anything, but it pitches for 1, so that's 1. Attack is 5, you go to 6, you block 2, you go to 8. Then you minus 1 because typically you run Rabble in a heavy red deck, so it's going to be -1, so it knocks you back down to 7. But then it has go again, so you add another one, and so forth. And most attack action cards are going to land on the value of 8. Now, defense reactions are going to typically land on a value of 5, the ones that people want to play. You do the same thing. You just skip the attack, and you say, okay, Sink Below is a pitch that's +1 and it blocks 4. So it's a 5, quote unquote. I don't want to say value, but the balancing value on the card is at a 5, which is lower than 8. And the reason for that is it's much simpler to extract that specific number of value, and those cards tend to be a lot more restrictive. And then attack reactions typically are sitting at a 4 instead of a 5. The perfect example of that would be, like actually a 6. If you take like the 1 for 3 warrior reactions, right? They always cost 1, they pump 3, and they block 3. So it would go to 6, but it costs 1, -1. It actually lands on 5 as well. Nope, but then it pitches, so it goes back up to a 6. So just wanted to give this as an idea. A lot of people don't know about this, but it is a thing. Okay. So keywords have fluctuating value. A lot of people like to just say, oh yeah, go again is 1 value. I actually just did that on the previous slide, but that's not always the case. You can't put a static value on, I think, any keyword in the game. And it's because the context of the keyword is so important. So you basically have so if you have 2 head jabs, right? Just a 0 for 3 with go again, and you play both of them, the value on the second go again is literally 0 because you're not utilizing it. If that's the only thing you're doing that turn, right? So your go again wasn't worth anything. Whereas the first one, you would have extracted value because it allowed you to play the second one. Dominate. Okay, any Bravo player on the planet will tell you that dominate turn over turn is not the same thing, right? Playing a crippling crush while they have no armor with dominate versus having armor with dominate are 2 completely different scenarios. Now, there are situations in the game where it is correct to do the dominate while they have armor, to get the armor, to then get to the game state of presenting the dominate with them not having armor. So sometimes you have to take the less efficient approach to get to a game state of where you can actually extract that value. And then, of course, everybody knows Intimidate. It's only valuable if they want to block. Everybody knows that Rhinar is pretty bad into any like legit aggro matchup. And it's just because he doesn't produce the numbers. Intimidate has no text, basically. We've all heard that term. And then Spectra has a linear value that's correlated with the opponent's action point economy, right? Everybody, Guardians hate Spectra, right? And then, Room Blades and Ninjas historically have not really cared that much because they can always clean it up at the end. On hits have variable value based on the opponent's willingness to block, right? So throwing a snatch at a deck like Zen, of course they have the armor and it gets a little hairy there, but presenting an on hit against a deck that does not want to block versus playing a CNC against a Decimator Axe Dory is like two completely different situations. So you can't just say, oh yeah, CNC has X value because it has an on hit. It's very shaky, and understanding that will help you sideboard those cards out is the most important thing. That's like the most important thing, is understanding that certain things just don't hold the same value as you take things. Against certain heroes, knowing when to take things out is very, very important. Okay, so we're going to break down the card types. All right, we have what I like to call extenders, right? Something that allows you to scale offensively. And they typically are going to be of lower value for obvious balancing reasons, right? Let's say Nimblism, added 4, right? Or a head jab came in for 4, right? Like, why would you ever run a sink below if you could just head jab for 4 over and over and over again and it wasn't conditional what your opponent did, right? So typically they have a lower rate / value, but if you draw a bunch of them in your hand, which we're going to get to what it kind of look like, and then most of the time some of them have a condition like Pommel. You got to play it on you have to have another attack to play it with, or on your hammer or whatever. And then Nimblism obviously is going to require another attack action to be paired with it. And then of course they're going to have lower block values because they're meant for offensive output. So the opportunity cost built into it is going to be into that defense value typically. Looking at an example in a hand, right? What I mean by an extender is if Nimblism was another Snatch or another Warmonger's Diplomacy, the hand did not scale anymore, right? Like you basically have a couple lines where you can go E-Strike, go again in the Snatch. Maybe a weapon swing if your deck has that built into it. But Nimblism just allows you to scale the offensive output, and even E-Strike to a certain extent is also an extender if you use it in the correct manner. Allows you to extend the hand offensively and really push the numbers up. But if you notice on all the card or some of the cards, the block values do suffer. Just keep that in mind. Then you have what I like to call restrictors, kind of the opposite of extenders, where they have very, very high initial value when played, but they're restricted on how they can be played, right? We're thinking Eye of Ophidia, right? Or any like legendary gem. It can only be pitched, right? Which can kind of hem you up in some spots. It can not hem you up, but just pitching a blue and getting extra value is absolutely insane in the game of Flesh and Blood, but it comes at a risk. They do not scale, like I said, and they typically have higher values. And then during some game states, they can be considered a brick. As an example, and then don't put too many in your deck as well. As an example, let's look at this hand. if somebody threw a CNC at you, right? You're basically screwed because of the hard to find out, right? If it was anything else, you could just block with what theoretically could be a blue 3 block and then CNC and then hopefully like scrap together. You could arsenal a D react or something along those lines. But let's say that it's not even the worst case scenario and they didn't send a CNC at you. If you draw this hand, whether your opponent has assuming you don't have like a weapon that's static on the board, drawing the Heart of Findale basically says, hey, you're going to cast this Command and Conquer unless you sink it out of your hand. But then you're taking a lot of risk because if you don't draw a blue, then you don't have then you're not doing anything, right? So there's a lot of risk. Basically, having Heart of Findale in your deck can force you into some situations in the game that a lot of people kind of overlook. If you've played Icelander, you know exactly what I'm talking about. And just like this example, drawing Heart of Findale just forces you into playing that CNC because you just can't do anything else with the card. Sink, Blow, and Fate Foreseen. Imagine drawing 2 of them and your opponent not attacking you. You know exactly what I'm talking about, right? It's just a dead card. It doesn't scale in any way or anything. It's conditional to extract value from it. Your opponent has to attack. Okay. So the next one's going to be board state cards. They're basically investments. Simple as that. And they give no immediate value, but they can produce value at a later point in time. And they typically do not have go again. So you're going to end your turn on it more times than not. Usually it requires synergy to extract the value. So passing Mirage, it requires you to utilize illusionist attacks, things like that. Most of the auras and most of those auras in the illusionist require you to have synergistic plays to be able to actually extract value from. But some stuff like Epot, like anybody can play Epot, but if New popped an Epot, there's no way she's getting 3 value from an Epot unless you just have like a Epot pummeled deck or just something off the wall crazy. Don't try that at home. It's not good. But Kano has almost infinite scaling with resources. So he's one of the few decks that can extract a ton of value by playing that onto the board and then utilizing it on the turn. That really, really matters. And these cards always suck at blocking because if they did block well, there would be no opportunity cost associated with running them, and everybody would run them. I thought about not making this slide because there's literally like nothing to say here, but attacks are attacks. It's like as simple as that. I will say that there's one little nugget I can give, and that is there's a huge difference between positive and negative disruption. I have an example on the screen of Snatch, which is a form of positive disruption. Positive is in you gain a benefit if the card hits, and then CNC would be a negative disruptive effect. And why is that important, knowing the difference in kind of how it interacts in the game? Well, certain decks have the way that they combat other decks, you gain more from positive or negative disruption accordingly. I'll give you an example. Typically in the history of Flesh and Blood, if 2 aggro decks are going at each other, okay, the way that one aggro deck prevails over the other is usually never negative disruption. It's usually more on hits as far as like positive disruption. Because typically in the game of Flesh and Blood, your negative disruption has a higher cost curve. And those lean aggro decks do not want to play those cards because it kind of drawing them kind of disrupts the deck in and of itself. However, let's say you're trying to punish an aggro deck and you're not an aggro deck. Then the negative disruption is the way that you target that deck and vice versa, right? So that's very important on kind of how to differentiate between the two and when one is worth it and when one is not. Okay, and then I think, which is the last one, we have combo cards, right? And they just enable certain win conditions, and they typically require other cards / game states to extract the full amount of value. A good example is having 1 Lumina versus 2. One's depressing, one's not. And then Wildfire, of course, everybody knows that one. And then you have the good old-fashioned ALS loop. And however, most of the time it is kind of subject to arsenal disruption, because typically anybody that's ever played against Bolton or with combo Bolton, you always put the Beacon or the Lumina in arsenal. Typically the first one is Lumina, and you wait and draw the other piece. So you're really worried about that arsenal disruption. Some can be consistent, some can be inconsistent. I would consider, the ALS loop and the Wildfire pretty consistent, whilst Bolton's, it does happen, but there's no way that you can make plays to expedite it. It's just how close to the top of the deck is it kind of situation. So you're kind of just at the mercy of the cards and how they're shuffled. Whereas the other two, you can lessons for it to get it early. You can opt more, stuff like that. And then Prism can do whatever she wants with her deck half the time. Okay, so now we can discuss the turn cycle evaluation and kind of like giving us a reason on why we care about the card values. I'm going to just put out the math. It's super simple. Turn cycle value per card is, once again, damage threatened, damage prevented, divided by cards invested. It's basically the exact same equation that we looked at for card value. It's just talking about a time period of a turn cycle. And the turn cycle is going to be the end of your turn to the end of your next turn. Newer players often get to where they're like, oh, is it just my offensive turn is the turn cycle, or just the defense? No, it's the combination of the two. That's obviously very obvious for people who've been playing the game for a while. And the arsenal should be viewed as investing value from the current turn to a later turn. However, there are exceptions. Basically, the very concept of the ponder token kind of renders that sentence invalid in a sense, because you are not allowed to play your pondered card, right? So that is effectively, I don't want to say a free card because you had to earn it, but it should not be viewed as investing in a later turn. Whereas instead of playing the Nimblism, you arsenal it for a bigger next turn. That would be more support what I was referring to. On rate is typically considered around 3.5 value per card in the game of Classic Constructed over the length of the game. But some decks can obviously push, some decks I've seen as high as 40, 50 per card, per turn, which would be what? If you did 3.5 times 4, that'd be 14 per turn cycle. So if somebody was at 40 or something, they're roughly at like 3 times the average, give or take. So that's pretty outstanding. But you're looking at about 14 value per turn cycle is kind of your goal to be on rate in the game of Classic Constructed and Flesh and Blood. Okay. Let's look at this example. So we had a conversation in the Discord, sorry about that, where sorry about that, everybody. So I thought I heard something. So we had a discussion in the Discord about basically the value of Prismatic Leyline. And I thought I would kind of like show the math behind, because it's something where it's very easy to say that is a 1 card 6 or a 1 card 5 or a 1 card 4 or 1 card, whatever the case may be. And I think it's a great card to kind of show the idea that you have sometimes to evaluate 1 card, you have to look at the turn cycle, or else you are coming up with an inaccurate valuation of a card. And so I've laid out a situation. This is the hand. I picked 5 because it's super, super simple, right? relatively. I've set the stage that really the only information you need to know is we have the weapon, we have a Phoenix Flame in the grave, and we do not have Shuko. We've already blocked with it, is the situation. Okay, so somebody might say, well, Fi does his thing, right? He wants to present damage. So we're going to go to our first line where we play the Prismatic Leyline, which gives a +1. You can see the math below. To the Brand with Cinder Claw, making it come in for 4. Okay, and we pitched the Lava Vein Loyalty to swing the Ember Blade, which gives us another 3. Then we play the Ronin Renegade for 1 plus the 3 from the Leyline, and then we can play or Arsenal the Rising Resentment, and then finish with the Phoenix Flame. Okay, so this is basically the turn if you played it out completely offensively with the Leyline. So what is the actual value of Prismatic Leyline? Some of you might say, oh, well, it got 4 value from the blue, or 3 value from the blue and 1 from the red. Therefore, it was a 1 card 4, right? And you would be wrong. Prismatic Leyline is not a 1 card 4 in this situation. And allow me to show you the second line. Keep in mind, the value of this turn cycle is going to be 15 with 5 cards invested. So 15 divided by 3 comes out to 3 value per card. If we go to our second line, where we simply block with the 2/3 blocks to get the accumulation of 6 value, 3 from each, right? And then we pitch the 2 block blue instead of playing it for our Ember Blade. Then we come out to a value of 3 plus 3 plus the optional 3 or Arsenal, and then finishing with the 1, which means that the value would actually come out to 16 or 3.2 per card. So the actual value on Prismatic Leyline would be closer to 3. Because what a lot of people don't want to factor in is by playing Prismatic Leyline, you're forced into playing said shitty blue card instead of blocking with less shitty blue card, right? And that, so you have to factor in the opportunity cost associated with a card forcing you to do something. It's very important to keep that in your mind when you make that decision, right? You can't just say, oh, it did +4, it's worth 4. No, it made you take a card that theoretically could have been 3 value because you could swap the Ronin Renegade with the Lava Vein Loyalty, block 3, and not play a blue out. But it's actively forcing you to play a card for 1 value to then extract more value from the Leyline. It's why Leyline's a bad card. Secret's out. The exception to that case, obviously, is going to be a deck like New, where the blue cards have like serious on hits that can extract so much value. So scaling it up basically plays right into New's game plan, where she wants the opponent to have the smallest hands possible. And yeah, like, it's as simple as that. So in a deck like New, it might make sense because it's like the only deck in the game where the blues have like serious on hits. But other than that, it's pretty bad. So I hope that was a very clean kind of like example on that. Looking at Leyline as a 1 card 4, obviously we know over how that was just incorrect. Yes, you're 100% right that obviously we're just looking at the mathematics behind it. Yes, there are situations where, say they're at 3 life, then this line is actually the better line because you're just trying to get cards out of their hand, right? You're just trying to but just game state aside, we're just looking at the mathematical principle behind applying a value to certain cards. Example 2 is better in every single way. 1, you get to, that's not even factoring if you block 6, did you like block a CNC that stopped an on hit? You know, like there's just so many so many ways that this line is just mathematically better. Once again, cannot express it enough that when you try to get a value from a card, ask yourself, is that card forcing you to do something below rate to get X value? And if the answer is yes, then you have to combine the two things to get the actual appropriate value from that card. And that's not even factoring in the opportunity cost of running a card like this in fight. It's not a draconic starter. It's not an attack action that helps with Shuko. There's so many things that this card doesn't do. We're not even factoring in any of that. So we're going to come up with another example, less about the number, but I just wanted to give a good example of, if we're being honest, why the game of Flesh and Blood is so damn good, is how many decision points are basically made in a given turn cycle. And it just scales. I mean, it's just astronomical, the amount of decisions made every single turn cycle in the game of Flesh and Blood. I think it's why the game is so good, me personally. So here we're looking at an example just like before, where we have some context, right? Our only weapon is spider bites, whether we have two of them, whatever the case may be. Or I guess in this case, you could put in another dagger, but it's not. It kind of is relevant, but I'll get to him. We have a rousing wave up. We have tunic counter on 3. And we're playing new. And the context is the opponent has no armor. Bite is effective against the hero. So, like, what do I mean by that? Like, spider bite against certain illusionists or people that play a lot of non-attacks is like very ineffective, like warrior basically. So we're basically saying we're playing against, I don't know, mechanologists or something, where they have a lot of attacks is what we're saying. And we're also under the assumption that you can block for full value on every single card if you so wish. And so basically this is going to be the starting process for your decision making in this turn cycle, right? Is you're going to draw the hand of the 4 cards that we see, the double blue, the E-Strike, and the CNC. And you're going to look at your hero and you're going to say, I'm playing new. What is the number one thing I need to be doing? I need to be disrupting, right? That's like my number one goal is I want to be disrupting my opponent. So basically your eyes should lock onto CNC and say, I want to cast this card. That's your main offensive goal. Okay, now there is in a deck like Assassin, there are ways to supplement that. Basically, you can float your arousing wave by not swinging your dagger, or you can take tunic counter and swing spider bite into a CNC. But then you have a couple options. You can E-Strike go again, sinking the infect. You can block with the 2 cards for 6 value. You can kind of do whatever you so wish. We're gonna get into that. Noah, we're gonna get into that. I got a whole flow chart made on the decision making process of one single turn cycle making in new, right? This is why Flesh and Blood is amazing. This is like a super simple hand, right? 2 blues, 2 attacks. Like, this is like as simple as it gets. And there's this many decisions to be made, right? And basically what you can do is just start from the do you have full tempo box and then follow your way down into whatever the situation is. And you have the culmination of what I think one of these is doubled up because you take this line just for max damage. But I think there's 1, 2, 3, don't count this one, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 different lines that you can take or results. And that's just like the most competitive, viable line. That's not including like the dog shit plays like double spider bite CNC or anything crazy like that. Like, you could take that line, but you could also lose the game, right? That is a legal choice that you can make. So there's theoretically even more decisions on top of that. And, but it basically boils down to, do you have full tempo, right? And the reason I'm asking this question is, does it give you the opportunity to extract the block value from the E striker and the infect? If the answer is no, get the block value. If the answer is yes, then you have the option to play the E strike as an extender for the 5 go again. And this means that the quote unquote below rateness of the 2 card 5 or 2.5 value per card is not coming at any cost. It's just you have full tempo, so you're just playing your hand the way that it scales. So therefore, it would be appropriate to play what I consider is the worst mode of E strike. Okay, and then after you play out your E strike, if you decide to, then you have, do they have an arsenal, which is kind of what Noah was getting at, which is very important for the CNC, right? Because you never want to throw a CNC while they don't have arsenal, unless you are forced into it because you read the opponent's turn wrong or something along that line, or they just didn't present enough damage for you to adequately get value from blocking or something along those lines. And if they do, then you have the option to double dagger CNC arsenal, because that's once again assuming you had full tempo. So you need to utilize all the cards, or you can E strike go again into CNC is kind of your, and of course you still have the option to float the arousing wave or put the dag. Every single one of these flowchart decisions has this built into it. I just didn't want to make a whole different box, 2 boxes for every single decision. So this can just be assumed to be applied to every single final decision, right? And then if they don't have the arsenal, well, then you kind of dagger into E strike for 7, arsenal CNC, E strike go again. If the board state just needs you to push life totals, then you can E strike go again and play the CNC for just 6 value. Is perfectly valid. And then we can go down the, you don't have full tempo. We'll get 6 value from your blocks here. And then you have what seems kind of obvious, but it's very difficult because this is predicated on their turn, part of the turn cycle, where you have to make an educated guess on how their turn's going to play out to be able to identify early enough that they will or will not have an arsenal. And if you come to the conclusion that they will not, then E strike 7, arsenal CNC, block 6 more, arsenal CNC, block 3, E strike 7 are like your appropriate lines to make if you do not think they have an arsenal. But if you think they're going to arsenal, then you open up yourself to 2 more possibilities. So that's kind of what I wanted to present, how deep a turn cycle can get off of just a simple 4-card hand. I mean, no reactions, no, the sirens call. What do I do if it hits? What do I do if it doesn't? None of that. This is as easy as it gets, except for playing something like fire or something, But this is its most basic, and it's actually kind of daunting. And so, if anybody's playing Flesh and Blood at even a casual level, look at the decisions you're making without realizing, and it's actually pretty fucking cool. I'm not gonna lie. So this is just off the rip flowchart for basically this 4-card hand. Just once again, I wanted to show the thought process going down a turn cycle to extract the maximum amount of value after giving everything a numerical value, so that way you can basically do. If anybody was to ask me what is the best way to consistently win armories, that was their goal as a player. They weren't trying to win a calling. They weren't trying to win the Pro Tour or something like that. They just wanted to be good casual. I would say today's lesson is what they need to know, right? Just knowing strong value and have awareness. Those are the 2 most important aspects to just be hitting that threshold to where you can start to win, you can start to have the ability to win most games. Now sometimes you're just going to get outplayed, and that's part of it. Fab has a a pretty strict learning curve, but we're trying to reduce that now. So, and if that wasn't enough, just to give a glimpse, and this is kind of like hitting on what we're going to kind of be getting into the next couple weeks, is we just went over the numbers, right? E strike for 7, good. E strike 5, go again. Most of the time bad, but sometimes appropriate. There's a lot of macro strategies that supersede just playing by the numbers, right? A good example of that is playing against Enigma, right? Like Enigma builds a board state, and if you do not clear the board state, they get astronomical amounts of value. So play blocking 6 with your E strike and your other 3 block, if they have a board, is usually very, very wrong. Even if the numbers are bad, because you're just going to allow them to do better math, is what you're doing by making that play. And so we didn't even consider macro strategies like that. And then being able, I cannot stress this enough, being able to accurately map out the possible conclusion of your opponent's turn is one of the most important aspects of maximizing value, right? Kind of goes with like the block down priority. So I'll kind of dig a little bit deeper into that. But like taking this hand, like the least important card is one of the blues, okay? So after you block with one of the blues, say early in the chain or something like that, you then have a decision. You have to read, what is your opponent going to threaten anything, right? If you hold the E strike too late, then you present a situation where you can't, you kind of limit your options if you wait a little bit too long. But if you block a little too early, then maybe they have a weak ending to their turn, and you would rather keep the E strike for your arsenal, right? It's kind of like some really big points to kind of consider. So the flowchart did not even factor in things like life totals, cards used / not, how many of this are left in their deck, how many of this is left in my deck, because there's lines with the CNC of like, oh, I don't have one engraved for Codex, so maybe I need to block with it and then just E strike for 7. Like that's a whole nother branch off of decision making on the macro scale that wasn't even considered. And then of course you have opponent on hits, do we need to block? Do we not need to block kind of situation? And then once again, graveyard state, like I mentioned before. 4 cards like Codex of Frailty and whatnot. So that is going to kind of conclude the first lessons of learning curves. So like I said, I wanted to dive a little bit in, but not go like too off the edge for the first one, obviously. And at the same time, I wanted to present it in a good enough way to where it's very easy for most people to understand, and hopefully they got some amount of value from it. Once again, I am all ears for feedback on whether that was too much, too little, go deeper, you went too deep, whatever the case may be. I would love feedback in any form, comment, message me on Twitter, message me on Discord, whatever the case may be. I would love the feedback. 100%.